Bienvenidos, Hushamdi, and welcome to this Hut 8 networking Techtorial on the new Cisco DevNet Associate Certification 200-901. In this Techtorial, we're going to be focusing on how to parse JSON data using the Python programming language. Now, there is a little bit of foundational work that we have to cover to fill in some of the gaps to get from programming with Python to actually parsing JSON data. So I'm going to be breaking this down into multiple parts, and I think it's going to end up being 3 parts in total. So what are you going to learn as part of this Techtorial? Well, we're going to be talking about Python data structures, specifically dictionaries, because those play an integral part in the application that we're going to be building. And we're actually going to be using the MapQuest Developer Application Programming Interface, or API. And we're going to be making a request, and we're going to get data back that's going to be in JSON or JavaScript Object Notation format. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the other types of formats that are out there as well. So let's go ahead and clarify what we're going to be doing here. So we're going to introduce learners to the art of parsing JavaScript Object Notation or JSON data using the Python programming language by way of the MapQuest API. Now, we have some prerequisites that are going to be very, very important. First and foremost, you're going to need access to Python 3. Now, everything I'm going to be doing is going to be on an iMac Pro, and on this iMac Pro, I have the Anaconda distribution installed. And the reason for that is the Anaconda distribution comes with hundreds of different Python libraries or modules that you don't get in the Mac OS X release of Python 3. But we're going to be talking about pip, and we're going to look at how we would install some of the additional modules that we're going to need access to. So don't panic if you don't have Anaconda. Again, as long as you've got Python 3, you're going to be able to do exactly what we're going to be doing here. Now, let me transition here real briefly to this DevNet Associate Exam Topics webpage on the Cisco Learning Network to highlight in the exam description, in terms of the topics that we're going to be covering, where this information that we're going to be covering falls. And you can see right here, right out of the gate, compare data formats, XML, JSON, and YAML. Describe parsing of common data formats, XML, JSON, and YAML. And you'll notice to Python data structures. And those are the Python data structures I was making reference to earlier. Now, the dictionary in our application plays a critical role. That's why I highlighted the dictionary. But again, we'll be talking about other Python data structures like the list. So don't panic if you're not familiar with those. And you can see down here, understanding and using APIs. Construct a REST API request to accomplish a task given API documentation. And that is actually what we're going to be doing as part of this activity. We're going to be using that MapQuest Developer API in order to get back data in the form of directions in JSON format, right? That common data format, which is going to be JSON, and we're going to parse that JSON data to pull out or extract the data that we're looking for. All right, well, let me clear the screen here. Now, the reason I said Python 3 is because Python 2 has been sunsetted. And I've got a quick web page here at python.org, and you can see that as of January 1st, 2020, so over a month ago, there will be no more improvement or development done on Python 2. So Python 2 is end of life, end of support, end of everything. Now, another prerequisite is going to be this JSON view, and I'm going to be using the Chrome web browser here, Google Chrome, and you would just simply add it to Chrome, and it's going to tell you it can read everything, and I'll just say add extension, and then it's going to go through and now it has been added. So JSON view is what we added, and we'll come back to this a little bit later on when we go to take a look at what some of the JSON data is going to look like when we make our request. So again, this video is going to be tightly coupled with the DevNet Associate exam blueprint in terms of comparing data formats, describing the parsing of that common data, and constructing REST APIs, or REST API requests, I should say. All right, so let's take a step back here. The MapQuest Developer API key. Now, you're going to need an API key, but you get 15,000 requests if you have a key. So I'm more than happy to share my key here with you. And this is the key value right here. And again, remember, you only get 15,000 requests. I highly recommend it takes not more than 2 minutes to sign up for your own MapQuest developer account, and you get your own key. And that key value is going to be critical because that is what we're using as a token to authenticate our REST API request, that RESTful request that we're going to be sending to the MapQuest API. And so we need that key, and you can use my key there, or you can go ahead and register for your own API key. And then we're going to need access to the Python requests module. Now, this module does not come by default with the OS installation of Python 3. But I'm going to talk a little bit about pip here in this video. And again, in this video, we're going to take this, we're going to start the script, and we're going to get it all the way to the point where we're making the JSON, or I should say, we're making that RESTful request to get the JSON data. And we're actually going to see what that data looks like. And then that's where we're going to break. And I'm going to split this up again. You'll see that there'll be a number of modules here that we want to break this up into to make it a little easier to understand. So we've got some key terminology that we need to talk about. So JSON is JavaScript Object Notation. Well, what does that look like? If I was to pull my web browser back up and come over here to the MapQuest Developer API for the get route API, you can see that this is how I'm going to interact. And here is what the JSON data looks like. Now, it looks like this in this box, nice and clean. And again, if you're familiar with Python, you'll notice that we've got what appear to be dictionaries here. Now, the curly braces in JSON represent objects, right? So JSON delineates objects with the curly braces, but it looks like a Python dictionary. So when you see these curly braces, think it's a JSON object. Now, JSON also has the square brackets. And when you look at that, you may be thinking, oh, it's a Python list. Well, JSON calls these arrays, right? So similar, but not exactly like Python. So again, when we see the curly braces with the JSON, we're thinking a JSON object. And there's many JSON objects in here, as you can see. When you see the brackets, or I said the square bracket, that is a JSON array, right? Similar to the Python list. And it looks nice and clean here. When we see what our application returns, it's going to be all jumbled together and a little more difficult to understand. But that is it. And here's what I want you to think about. When we looked at the exam topics, right? Data formats, right? Compare these common data formats. And so that's all XML, JSON, and YAML are. Is there simply different ways to provide you the data to your request, the answer or response to your RESTful request. And it's going to come back in one of these formats. Right now, you can sometimes pick the format, sometimes you can't pick. But the three common formats that the exam is going to be covering are XML, JSON, and YAML. We're working with JSON. But the takeaway here is, think of XML, JSON, and YAML as simply three different ways of responding to your request, and it's just a different way to format the data. And if I were to go back over here to the directions API for the get route, you can see that that's what XML looks like. It looks very much like HTML. And that is a format that you can get a response back in. This format, this common data format, can be given to you when you make your request to the MapQuest API. And again, we are focused on JSON. So that is what JSON is. And again, it's just a data format. YAML, XML, the same thing, a data format, but those formats are all different. So now let's talk about one of the very confusing terms that learners get kind of confused with here, and that's representational state transfer, or REST. Now, REST is not a programming language. REST is not a common data format like JSON, XML, or YAML. REST is nothing more than a framework. And you can think of it in loose terms, think of it as like a standard. And for something to be part of the REST standard, it needs to meet certain criteria, certain constraints, certain characteristics or traits. And so REST, in order for something to be considered part of the REST architecture or the REST framework, it needs to meet 3 standards. And we're talking about web services APIs here, right? Just like the MapQuest API we're going to be using, right? It follows and meets the REST constraints or the REST characteristics and traits. And so what are those 3 things? So a base URI, and you can see we've got that term down there, a uniform resource identifier. And you might be saying, well, wait a second, how is that different from a URL, right? A uniform resource locator. Well, just think of it like this. URI, URL, and web address, they're commonly used as synonymous terms. But technically, a URL is simply a type of URI. And it's one of the most common, right? Because everybody's familiar with http://, and then you put in your URL, right? So a URL is just a type of URI, and you'll hear me use web address or URL. But you need to have a base URI. So that's criteria number 1. Criteria number 2 is it needs to have standard HTTP methods like post or get or delete or put or head, right? And then the third criteria is it needs to have a media type. There needs to be some sort of a media type involved. So again, a base URI, a standard HTTP, support for standard HTTP methods like get, post, delete, etc., and then a media type. And so now let me transition back here to the browser, because you may be saying, well, wait, a media type, that doesn't make any sense. I've never heard JSON referred to as a media type. Well, lo and behold, RFC 4627 is the application JSON media type for JavaScript Object Notation, right? And so here is your media type. So again, a web service API that wants to adhere to the REST framework, right? To meet the criteria to be considered RESTful, and that's all RESTful is. RESTful is some sort of web service API that meets the REST criteria, and we call that a RESTful API. And so in order to meet those 3, the 3 criteria, if you've got a base URI, standard HTTP method support, and a media type like JSON right here, right, you are considered or could be considered RESTful. And so those terms are all very, very important terms. All right, so let's go ahead and let's get on to the CLI here, and let's talk a little bit about, talk a little bit about what it is we're going to be doing. Now, remember, the first criteria I said is that we need to have the requests module. But what I want to do first is let me run the application. And this is going to be what our application looks like when this application is set up and fully configured. So I'm going to enter my starting location. I'll put down Baltimore. My destination location, let me put Miami. I'm going to hit enter, and you can see we're going to get a set of directions here. And there you go, line by line, direction by direction. And if I scoot up a little further, this is a little more interesting what we want to look at. So here is the URL, right? And we can see we're using this RESTful API, and there it is. It's the route API, right? The MapQuest API, and it's the route. There is my key, which is that MapQuest developer key I showed you earlier. And I'm going to break down these lines, and we're going to talk about other characters you may see in here. This is just simply a separator. There's my from Baltimore, a little field separator, and then to Miami. And this is the GET request. This is the RESTful request that's being made to the MapQuest route API. And I send in my key, I send in my from city and my to city, and I get back my directions. Right? I see my trip duration in hours, 16 hours and 31 minutes. I see how many miles it would be to go from Baltimore to Miami. I can see how many gallons of fuel are going to be used. And again, these are all JSON objects that we are simply grabbing from the JSON data format response that we get back from the MapQuest API. And again, I'm going to break these down in what you might say is going to be excruciating detail. But again, we're going to take a very, very inductive approach here to make sure that you've got a really good understanding as to how all this is working. And again, this is just a for each loop that goes through and prints out turn-by-turn directions. And that's what these are. They're just simply turns. And then you can see the program continues to run. And I could even put in addresses. Let me put in my 3620 Oregon Drive. My home address as a child in Santa Rosa, California. Whoops. And let's go back here. Let's just say 3620 Oregon Drive in Santa Rosa, California, 95405. And then let's go to San Francisco, and I'll just say San Francisco, California. And you can see here it keeps everything on one screen. Trip duration an hour, 56 miles, 2 gallons of fuel, and that's pretty good average there on fuel. And you can see you go Oregon Drive to Carley Road, out to Sonoma Avenue, to Farmers Lane, Route California 12, out to 101. And again, you get the idea, and the program is just going to run and run and run. And what's doing this, again, is a RESTful request to the MapQuest API, and we're getting the data back in JSON format, and I'm doing all of this with a Python script. So this is the end game here. So now let's take a step back and talk about the requests module that we're going to need. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Python package installer pip, right? So if I want to see the version of pip that I'm using, I can simply type in pip -- version, and you can see I'm using version 18.1. Now, we're ultimately going to be upgrading this because that is actually a little bit old. Now, what if I were to say pip list? Well, this is going to show me a list of the packages that I have here. Whoops. And as you can see, it shows me the package and the version, and we can clearly see that I don't have the requests package here. It's not listed here at all. In fact, if I was to go into Python 3 and I was to say import requests, you'll notice that we get this no module found, right? Because we haven't imported or added it to our package library. And so that's why we received that error. Let's say Control D here, and you'll notice, and let's go ahead and do this right now, because chances are you're going to see this if you're running these commands on a Mac. And you can see here it says we're running version 18.1. However, version 20.0.2 is available. You should consider upgrading. So let's make that happen. Let me go ahead and say pip install -- upgrade pip. And what will happen is we'll need internet connectivity here. It's going to go out. And it's interesting, what you're seeing happen here is it's actually loading pip into memory and running it in memory because it's deleting the existing package. You'll notice, you can see here, it's uninstalling that existing package and successfully installing pip 20.0.2. So now if I was to come back and say pip -- version, we should see that we're running 20.0.2. Now, this is the Python install, again, that is the basic iMac or Mac OS X installation, right? I've got Anaconda on here and I'm going to move to that soon, but chances are you're running, if you're running on a Mac, this is what you're going to see. Now, what other things can we do? Well, I can go ahead, let me clear the screen here. I can say pip, and let's go ahead and install requests. So I would say pip install requests. Now you can see here we've got some requirements, right? And you may not see this. It may ask you, do you want to install these dependencies? And you're going to obviously say yes, but now requests should be installed. So if I was to say pip list, now we have requests. And that's how simple it is. And this is one of the great things about the Python programming language is it's that simple to add in additional packages, modules, right, that you're going to be using as part of your work. All right, so if we wanted to see, in fact, we can even say, and let me go ahead and pip, and I believe it's pip show requests. And this is going to show me information specific to the requests package that I just installed. In fact, we can see Kenneth Wrights is the author. You can contact him here, and it's licensed with the Apache 2.0. Now, you can see that we're doing this under the Python 3 library, right, for all of the packages that we're installing. So now we have requests. So if I said Python 3 and I said import requests, we don't see that error. In fact, we'll say dir, and it'll show me what's loaded into my current namespace, and lo and behold, there is requests. So this is going to be your first step. The first thing you're going to want to do is probably upgrade pip, and then you're going to go ahead and install requests. Now that we've got that installed, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead, and there's another module that we're going to be using, but that module should be included in your base installation, right? And that's called urllib.parse. All right, well, let's go ahead and let's create our script right now. I'm going to do a Control D here, and let's pull that back. All right, I'm just going to call this vi directions.py is going to be the name of my program. And I'm doing this in VI. You could do this in another editor that you're more comfortable with. It doesn't have to be VI. Let me give you some recommendations. You could be using IDLE, the Integrated Development Learning Environment. You could use Adobe Brackets, right? And here's some notes I had from coaching course I'm taking, right? So you could use Adobe Brackets and then come onto the CLI and run it. Again, it depends on your level of comfort and familiarity with the editor you're using. But again, there's multiple things you can do. IDLE might be the easiest way to get this done. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say import urllib.parse. Now, we need this, and you're going to see what this gets used for. We're going to give this method or this module, and there's a specific method we're going to be using called URL encode. We're going to pass it a dictionary, a Python dictionary with some values. It's going to take those values, it's going to mash them together, and it's going to create that URL that we saw earlier, right? It's going to create this URL. And actually, I'm sorry, let's come right back over here. It's going to create this URL for us, right? And I'm going to show you how it breaks it down. We're going to take a look at that module, and we're going to see how we construct all of this information. You can see there's quite a bit of information here, right? And that is what urllib.parse.url encode is going to be doing for us. It's going to put together our RESTful API GET request to the MapQuest API for a route. All right, let's go ahead and take a step back here. over to this window. So we're going to import urllib.parse, and then we're also going to import requests, right? That module that we just used pip to install. Now, we've got these two modules, so what's next? Well, now we need to create some variables for that API request, for the RESTful request that we're going to be making. So let me put a little comment in here. Create RESTful API call to MapQuest. And I'll come back up here and we'll say import needed modules. All right, so let me come down here and we'll try to keep it as clean as we can here. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a variable, and I'm sorry, I was moving back here, but I want to just come over to that screen there. So we need the base URL, which is going to be we're going to create a variable for the base main API URL here, the HTTPS. And in fact, I'm going to copy that right now. Let's come back over to this window, and I'm going to say base API URL. And it's a string, right? So here, and again, this is one of the great things I really like about taking Python and creating an application, something useful, because it gets you out of that mode where you're simply thinking about these abstract Python data types. Like, yeah, it's a string. Okay, I know it's a string. Well, what am I using strings for? Well, here is an example of what you're going to be using a string for. So we've just created a variable called base API URL, the underscores are in there, and that is the value. And we're going to be concatenating that with some other values. So the next value is I'm going to put down my start underscore location. And I'm going to hard code it in here right now. And we're going to crawl before we walk, before we run. So I'm going to hard code things in here so that we can get something working, and then we'll look at adding some spice to it, right? Spicing things up a little bit, and we'll get it to clear the screen and some other things like that. So my starting location, I'm just going to put in here Baltimore, right? And what about my destination location? Well, my destination location, let's try to pick something a little bit closer. I'll say, and well, actually Richmond's probably, I'll just put Miami. And we'll stick with Miami, right? Because those are two locations that aren't going to be confused with any other. Like there's a California, Maryland. And so I don't want to put California in there because maybe it ends up picking California, Maryland, which might not be what I want. And then the final variable is we're going to create something called API key. And what do you think that value is? You've got it. It's the MapQuest API key right here. And it only runs up to that little D. Again, I could go back out to the MapQuest screen and take a look at my key if I needed to, but that is the value. And there's the key. And so right now, we've got the base API URL for MapQuest. We've got our starting location, our destination location, and we have the API key defined. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use that urllib.parse module, and specifically a method that's in there called URL encode. So how are we going to do that? Because again, remember the end game here is, and again, this was the San Francisco example, but the end game is I need this URL. I need to create this so that I can request via a GET operation from the MapQuest API and request it in JSON format, the response to come to me in JSON format. I need that right there. Well, how do I get all of that? Because you can see, sorry about that, it's shifting on me here. Sorry about that. So you can see that we need to get all of this, and we do have a lot of it right now. We've got the base API right there. We have the key right there. We have the from, we have the to. Now we just need something that's going to put it all together and create that RESTful API call. So let me go ahead and we're going to simply say URL, right? So this is, and again, URI, URL, web address. I'm just going to use URL. So what am I going to be concatenating together? Well, the first thing is going to be the base underscore API underscore URL, and I'm going to be concatenating that to the rest of this information here. Now, remember, there were special characters in that HTTP string here, right? That's part of that RESTful call. Now, remember, the question mark we've accounted for, but what about key equal, right? What about the key? What about that ampersand that separates things here? What about this %2C and the plus signs? Where are those coming from? And we're going to talk about each of those in turn here. So we come back over the base URL. I want to concatenate that. And here's where we're going to put in this urllib.parse.url encode. And that's the method we're using there, is that URL encode method. So what am I encoding? Well, I'm going to be sending in a dictionary, right? A Python dictionary. I'm going to say key as, and again, a dictionary is nothing more than key value pairs, right? And that's what we're going to give to this URL encode method, which is part of the URL lib parse module, right? I'm going to pass this data in, and it is auto-magically going to create for me the from and the to and the key format that I need, and it's going to concatenate it to that base API URL. And then we're going to end up with this RESTful call, this information, this URL that we're passing in as a RESTful call to the MapQuest API. So what is my key value going to be here? Well, it's simply going to be the key, right? Or I should say, sorry, the API key, the API underscore key. Now let's go ahead and get the from and the to. So and actually let's say start location. So start location, and actually no, I can use from there. Sorry, it's going to be from. So my from is going to be it's going to be the start location. And sorry, I'm doing this from memory here. It's going to be the start location and then the to, right? Because that's what we see in that URL that's being passed. We see from, and we see to, and we see key. So the the to is simply going to be my destination underscore location. And you can see we just wrapped around the screen there, but that's okay. And there you go right there. And in fact, let me do this. Let's trim down destination location here. I'm going to try to keep everything on one line, and let's go to the end of that line, and let's pull back. And I'll just use destination. That way we can keep everything on a single line. And so we now have everything we need here in order to make that RESTful call to the MapQuest API. We've got the base API URL. We're concatenating that to what will be pulled together from this URL encode Python method, and it will give me, right? Or I should say it's going to give the MapQuest API this information right here. Again, our information, I'm pointing to this, and this is the San Francisco to Santa Rosa, but we know we're talking about Baltimore to Miami right now. So there's the URL. Now the question is, okay, that's great. You've got the URL. We've used this URL encode to create that base API URL with all of the other information that's going to be needed to send a RESTful request to the MapQuest API. So how do I make that request? Well, we're going to use the requests module that we imported earlier. And this is exactly why we imported this module. So here's what I'm going to say. JSON underscore response, because I'm going to request, right, that the information come back. So I'm going to say my JSON response, and that's a variable name. So I'm going to be storing whatever's returned to me, and it's going to be all of that information we saw earlier in JSON format. And I'm going to store it in that JSON underscore response variable. I'm using an HTTP GET, right? Remember, the 3 criteria that we need to meet that RESTful standard, one of the criteria is a base URI and its support for standard HTTP methods. So yes, the MapQuest API is RESTful because it supports this method, this HTTP GET method. Okay, so what am I going to send in? Well, we saved off our URL that we created with all of that information into the variable named URL. And so here I'm basically saying, I'm sending an HTTP request. It is a GET request. Here is the URL, which we created here, that I'm passing as the argument, right, to this GET request. And how do I want the information, the response to come back? What is the common data format that I would like to get back? And I want it in JSON format, because that is what we're talking about here. And finally, and again, this is a little crude right now, we'll clean things up a little bit later, I'm going to print out the JSON response. And this is going to show me the JSON data. And this is actually our stopping point here. After we run this, this is going to be where we break as for part 1. So let's go ahead, let's save this file. Let's clear the screen, and let's come in here and let's say Python 3 directions.py. Now, we may get I'm not sure my permission settings, the defaults here, but let's see what happens. And it looks like we're going to be good. And there is all that JSON data. Now, you'll notice that that is not very pretty, right? And it's not nice to look at. And this is one of the intimidating things about parsing JSON data, is when you see it like this, it is not very attractive. So again, we've hard-coded that information into our script. Let's go ahead and do this. Let me go ahead and VI that file again. And it's easy enough to come in here and change this. Let me change this from Baltimore to Santa Rosa, my hometown. And I'll put in here California. And then let's come down here and change this to San Francisco. Now, I'm showing you this because I showed you earlier, we have it set up to prompt us and to run again and again and again. Here's what we're doing now, right? Before we start to run, this is us walking, and here is us clearing the screen and then rerunning this. And you'll notice we don't get as much information, but that is JSON format right there. That's exactly what we're looking at. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, how would I see the URL? Well, to see that, we just have to print out that URL. And let's do that down here at the very, very bottom. Let's add in a print, and I'm going to print our URL. And now we're going to look at the JSON View plugin that is part of Google Chrome that I just added to Google Chrome. So let's run that again. And the last thing that we should see is our MapQuest URL. And there it is right there. So let me copy that. Let's go over here to Google Chrome. Let's open up a new window and let's add in that URL. And I'm going to hit enter. Now, the plugin that we have is what's facilitating us seeing the information like this. And there's all the turns, right? And you can see there is the route object that we're looking for. In fact, I could close these up, and there are the two objects, right? They look like Python dictionaries. And here are some of the other objects that are in here, right? We've got our longitude, latitude, come down to some more, the real time, right? How long is it going to take you? The amount of fuel used, has country cross, What are some other things? Session ID. Here's my session ID. There is the time, right? And that's that value we saw earlier. So here's where all of this information is being returned to you. And here's the different legs, i.e. the different turns that you're going to be making, right? Go south on US 101. And so you can see that's what the JSON format looks like. And again, it looks like Python data structures. It looks like dictionaries, which in JSON are objects. And it looks like Python lists, which in JSON, excuse me, I'm getting over a pretty bad sore throat, which in JSON, the list, I should say, what appears to be a Python list in JSON is actually a JSON array that'll have data in the array. And so that's what that JSON view plugin allows you to do in Google Chrome. So we've talked about quite a bit in this video. We have a working Python application that is making RESTful calls to the MapQuest RESTful API, right? So we've got all of this set up right now. Let's take a look one last time here, and let's simply cat out that file, directions.py, and that's it. That's all that's required. Right? And so this is a great stopping point right here. You've got something up and running. You can experiment with this. Change the start location, change the destination, and see what happens. And when we come back in subsequent videos, we're going to be taking a look at how to clean that up and how to get it so that it runs until we quit. It's going to run, and it gives us the directions in a nice laid out format. And we pull out some of those objects, those JSON objects, like the trip time, like the amount of fuel that's going to be used, like the number of miles that are going to be traveled. All right, well, that is going to do it for this video. Again, I'm really excited about this. There's nothing better than taking things that you've been learning about, right? Like I teach the Python programming language all the time, but it's not until we get and have an application, an actual use case of all of that Python programming information that we've learned, that it starts to become exciting, and you can really start to see some of the really incredible things that you can do by using Python. All right, thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.